afternoon and welcome to this webinar exploring the complicated compliance landscape for Australian employers under the Model Work Health and Safety legislation. I'm Ray Welling, Editor-in-Chief of Workplace Info and Workplace WHS, and today we're going to look at how the government attempts to simplify safety requirements for companies that operate across state borders has fared. Joining our panel of experts today is Joe Murphy, the Director of Workplace Relations for Australian Business Lawyers and Advisors, and Dr. Sharon O'Neill, Research Fellow at the Macquarie University International Governance and Performance Research Centre. Joe, Sharon, welcome.
Hello, thank you.
Now, I'll start off with a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any technical issues or you'd like to post a question to either of our panelists, you can do that by typing your query into the chat box, which you'll find in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Now, we received quite a few questions in the lead up to the webinar, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can during the time we have together. And those that we don't answer, we will actually try to answer as follow-up. I'd also like to point out that the information provided in the webinar today is general information only, so it does not take into account your own particular work situation or your objectives and needs. Before you act on any information contained in the discussion we're going to have today, you should consider the appropriateness of the information, having regard to your own objectives and your work and financial situation and needs. Joe, let's kick off the discussion with a look at the history of the model legislation and how we got to where we are today.
Amongst the states, territories and the Commonwealth in respect of work health and safety laws. There was considered to be quite a diverse range of obligations on employers, and Australia has become a much more integrated economy in terms of its state, the activities of its states and territories, and it was seen as being a natural progression from that broken arrangement that existed before. So the states and territories and the Commonwealth got together, they signed an agreement that they would proceed with a view to implementing harmonised legislation on the 1st of January, 2012. Sorry, I've got someone telling me here to speak up. What then happened was, at that time, with all due credit to Western Australia, they said at the time, we're going to be difficult through this process. They were honest about it, and full credit to them, they've made good on that promise. What we have seen, though, is that since that time, Queensland made good and commenced on the 1st of January 2012. New South Wales was made good on their promise and commenced on the 1st of January 2012. The Northern Territory did so. The Commonwealth also did that. And to follow them was Tasmania on the 1st of January 2013. We have South Australia as well getting on board. What we have left is Victoria and Western Australia still hanging out there without harmonised legislation. Some of the questions that are posed to us regularly are what's happening with Western Australia and Victoria. And I think it fluctuates, but what we have heard is that Western Australia will be implementing in the future legislation that will mirror aspects of the current harmonised legislation that the other states and territories have implemented. But they're yet to settle on exactly certain points that they will be happy about harmonising and the ones that they won't be.
I think they mentioned mining industry in particular. Do you know why they've isolated that as opposed to looking across the board?
Look, I think that's a historical hangover, and Western Australia, as we know, is a very strong mining state, as is New South Wales, as is Queensland, and those states tend to have had historically separate legislation in relation to their workers' compensation when it comes to mining, and also separate regulation at the very least, and legislation when it comes to their work health and safety in the mining sector. It's a high-risk industry. There's a high rate of injury in those industries, and it's kind of a way of quarantining those industries. It can certainly be dealt with by including specific provisions within the existing legislation. However, they've chosen in the past, and they've chosen going forward to deal with that by way of separate legislation or separate regulation, depending on which state or territory you're in. Which you might find, such as in the ACT, they're looking at a separate regulation for mining.
Right.
So that was the implementation of the background about how this all came about. What we then had was broadly, the changes across the jurisdiction was a refocusing from an obligation purely on employers and a move to the concept of a person conducting a business or undertaking. And the person conducting a business or undertaking was expanded so that it wasn't just persons who employ people, but it also included direct employers, contractors or subcontractors, sole practitioners who are conducting their own business. They may not have any employees at all, and it included mostly incorporated businesses and unincorporated businesses, but it doesn't include a few minor things like volunteer associations that don't employ people. But really, the vast majority of businesses that are conducting a business or an undertaking are captured by the legislation.
Whereas a lot of them weren't captured under the previous legislation.
Well, it was really about, yes, some of them weren't captured, but it was really about the focusing on work health and safety. If you were an employer and it said the focus is on you, your health and safety obligations are focused on you as an employer, people tended to think my obligations are in respect of my employees. You look after your employees and I'll look after mine. And really, there needed to be a focus around looking after everyone who comes to your workplace or comes into connection with the work or the business that you undertake at the time. So I think that was the right thing to do by the states and territories and the Commonwealth at the time. That refocusing really assisted in refocusing the attention of those businesses on health and safety. There's also a refocusing around the obligation, not just on the employers becoming persons conducting business or undertaking, but those persons conducting a business or undertaking, or initialised to be PCBUs, have an obligation not just in relation to their employees, but into workers at large, rather than just employees. And workers captures, not just your direct employees, but your contractors, your subcontractors, your labour hire employees, your outworkers, your apprentices, people, kids conducting school work experience in the workplace, and volunteers. There is a broader obligation as well, which steps on to an obligation to ensure the health and safety so far as reasonably practical in relation to those who come into contact with your workplaces or attend your workplaces, or the work that you perform as a person conducting business or undertaking. Some of the other changes that occurred across the states and territories was changes from some of the traditional models of OHS committees and OHS representatives that they had, and they moved towards more of a model of health and safety representatives with elections for those health and safety representatives and rights for individuals or workers in the workplace to ask for health and safety representatives to be elected and represent them in health and safety matters. There's also a refocusing of the duties in relation to officers of an organisation, and Sharon's going to talk about this in a bit more detail about due diligence obligations, but there were two major things. They moved away from, in some states and territories, New South Wales being one of them, the obligation on directors and managers, and they moved that to a broader category in some respects of officers. So there was a refocusing of the laws around that, around those obligations, and the obligations were then of due diligence in relation to those officers were crystallised in the Act. And as I said, Sharon's going to talk in a little bit more detail, and I might drop in and have a few things to say about that. There are some differences between the states and territories. Some of them might be considered to be significant, others insignificant. We won't go into any great detail today about those, the smaller differences. But one of the things that New South Wales did was they retained the right to union prosecutions, which was something that many employer groups advocated against. It was probably not a large concession. I'm not aware of any prosecutions by unions. Sharon, have you heard of any?
Not that I'm aware of.
No, I haven't heard of any yet. They do take a while to come through the pipeline. They do tend to wait to the end of the period before they decide to commence anyway. So maybe we'll hear about some next year. But at this stage, yeah, we haven't heard much about that. They do have to jump through a few hoops before they can actually commence a prosecution anyway. WorkCover needs to consider whether or not they want to commence with it, and then it needs to go off to the DPP, and counters back, and if at that stage the union hasn't fatigued itself too much and is interested enough, they may commence a prosecution. The other thing that was significant in New South Wales was the removal of this reversal of onus of proof. You know, some people called it guilty until proven innocent in New South Wales, and that was qualified by the obligation that employers needed only to ensure the health and safety of workers and others in the workplace so far as reasonably practicable. That was something that was mounted more as a defence under the previous regime, the occupational health and safety legislation in New South Wales, but is now an upfront obligation and an upfront test in the event of a prosecution before a prosecution can commence under the Work Health and Safety Act in New South Wales and in the other legislation as well. A few other things I might mention is I was going to touch on duties, due diligence, but as I said, Sharon, look after that, is the penalties in New South Wales. The penalty regime was changed, and that was expanded from the previous regime where you had a first penalty would result in a particular fine, and a second or subsequent penalty would result in a potentially larger fine from a larger pool of money. Those fines went up from a maximum of 850 for a corporation to 3 million. I was going to say 300 million. 3 million for a corporation for a Category 1 offence, and the offences were changed to Category 1, Category 2, and Category 3 offences. Category 1 is an offence involving recklessness as to risk of death or serious injury. A Category 2 offence, which has a maximum fine of 1.5 million for a corporation, is where a person is exposed to a risk of serious death or serious injury without that requirement for recklessness. And a Category 3 is a breach of a duty without risk of death or serious injury, without the need for that, the exposure, just the breach of duty. And so that's the lowest level, and that is up to a $500,000 fine for a corporation. Now, there are fines for individuals as well, and officers and workers are treated differently under the penalty regime. For a Category 1, it's up to 600,000 or 5 years imprisonment for an officer. For a worker, it's 300,000 or up to 5 years imprisonment. For a Category 2, it's 300,000 and it's half that for a worker. And again, it's 100,000 for a Category 3 for an officer and half that again for a worker, up to $50,000. So that's a quick jaunt through the history, and many of you will have already heard that, but I thought it was necessary to traipse through some of what has occurred in the last couple of years and what currently sits in the legislation. And we'll get into a little bit more detail with some of the things that Sharon's going to talk through with the slide that she's kindly provided us with today.
Okay, great. Thanks for that update, Joe. As Joe mentioned, we now wanted to focus the discussion on one of the key sections of the legislation, which is Section 27, which covers the health and safety duty of officers. Now, Sharon, you've been doing a lot of research in this area. To start off with, can you explain the change from the old legislation about persons in control being accountable for ensuring health and safety?
Okay, I think if I can just flip through a couple of slides here, and is that all right? Okay. Sorry, I'll put it back on here. When we look at health and safety, we tend to think about industries that are fairly high risk, and these are the ones we tend to think of. We don't tend to think about boardrooms and offices. So what we're really looking at under the new legislation is a change in how the management and the governance of health and safety is perceived. So what I'll look at today, if I can just get to that question, is looking at the due diligence requirements on officers around harmonisation, risk perception, reporting and assurance. And so these are the three aspects. So in answer to your question, under the old legislation, we had a requirement for an employer to ensure the health and safety of employees. And that was the employer-employee relationship that Joe was just speaking about a moment ago. And there was also a requirement that directors or persons concerned with the management of a company were taken to owe that duty. So they had a duty to ensure the health and safety of employees. And these were a little different across the various jurisdictions, but generally they said things like a person concerned with management has a duty to ensure health and safety. In some jurisdictions they said a person who has to any extent management and control has that duty to ensure health and safety. So under the new legislation, what's a little bit different now is that the PCBU, person conducting the business or undertaking, has a duty to ensure the health and safety of workers. But rather than a fairly vague and often poorly defined person in control or management, we now have much greater clarity around the definition. So we've got better clarity about who is the people, who are the people that have that responsibility. And that's officers, which is defined under the Corporations Act 2001. So that's a director or a secretary of a company, any person that participates in decisions that affect a substantial part of the organisation, people who have the capacity to significantly affect the financial standing. So that captures really clearly people like the CFOs who were always responsible, they were always accountable, but it was very difficult to make that clear and to really hold them to account in many ways. And the other thing that's different now is instead of those officers having the responsibility to ensure health and safety, their obligations are to exercise due diligence to ensure the business ensures the health and safety. And here's where I think one of the other really great things about this legislation is the fact that it defines due diligence. So it not only helps us by defining who are the people that are responsible and accountable, but it also sets out very clearly what it is they need to do. So as Joe was saying before, we had this reverse onus of proof, and if there was a serious injury or a fatality, for example, you were by definition failing to ensure health and safety, and therefore you hadn't met that requirement. But now the requirements are that these officers exercise due diligence. And so if we have a look at what that actually means, they've actually specified 6 due diligence steps. So the first one is to acquire and keep up-to-date knowledge of work health and safety matters. So this requires officers to have some idea about health and safety, basic concepts. So what's the difference between, say, a hazard and a risk? It requires officers to not have that 1800s mentality that says every so-called accident is an act of God and it's from the blue. They have to have a basic understanding about hazards and risks and how these sorts of things can be foreseeable and what is reasonably practicable in terms of addressing those issues. So the second one says they also need to have an understanding of their own business. So understand the nature of the operations in your own organisation and the hazards and risks associated with those. And then ensure that the business has available and actually uses the appropriate resources and processes to eliminate or minimise those risks to health and safety. And I'll come back to each of these in a moment, but this is just a quick run through to start. It then talks about information. So we need to ensure, the officers must ensure that the business has appropriate processes for receiving information about incidents, hazards and risks, and that's important. It's not just receiving information about incidents, it's going into those 3 aspects, and we'll look at that. And also has processes not only to receive the information, but to consider it and to respond to it. So that takes that really active role. It takes it out of being this paper tiger that says we have to send reports here and there, but not necessarily do anything with it. So the new legislation actually tries to get that being a really active process within organisations. To ensure that the business has and implements processes for complying with any other duties and obligations under the Act. And finally, which is another very new one and really important, I think, in terms of the changes in the Act, is the last one, which speaks about verifying the provision and use. So that's about assurance. Directors have to have some processes there to have assurance that they know what's going on, that what they're saying is actually being implemented. So the things they put in place, things they think are being done are actually being done. When they allocate resources, the resources are actually going to those things they've allocated. them for. And so that aspect of assurance is also fairly new.
Now, is that verification, like, has the government developed some templates or frameworks that people use, or is it still, you know, you need to work out how you're going to provide that verification?
There's no templates that I'm aware of, and in the research we're doing at Macquarie University, one of the projects that we're working on at the moment is looking at companies of various sizes in various organisations to see how they're implementing these steps. And when it comes to verification, we've seen in all the organisations we've looked at that it's very new. It's something they're still grappling with. Some of the larger organisations in high hazard industries where they are very on the ball, they've focused a lot of attention on this, they're still going through process of mapping their risks and of trying to get steps in place to address some of these issues. And things like some of the organisations we've spoken to recently, putting steps in their processes that actually require checks and follow-up just to try and make sure this is happening. But it is very new. Internal audit is playing a big role in this space. That's one of the main ones that we're looking at the moment.
Yeah, certainly, Sharon, anecdotally, you know, through the clients and members that I've dealt with, this is a new concept to many of them. But I think one of the things you've just said is really important, that there are quite a category of, or quite a range of business that fall within a particular demographic, usually heavy industry, safety critical, that are used to doing safety audits. They're used to that verification process. They probably still required some updating in view of the new legislation, but largely we're on top of it. But there's a whole range of businesses out there with offices, and you know, any incorporated business is going to have an officer. In fact, you know, arguably any business is going to have some officer at some level, or any PCBU, I should say. So this obligation is on every PCBU, or an officer of every PCBU. And the challenge for those that haven't had it in the past is trying to find a model that suits them. And I think, Sharon, the work that you're doing with the university is really interesting. And I think, you know, you will find out the reason that we, or if you haven't already, I'm sure you have, the reason we don't have a standard form is because you cannot have a standard form that would cover every industry, every type of organisation of every size that can serve this purpose. It needs to be, in most circumstances, at least industry specific, and that's the real challenge for a lot of these businesses that haven't had this in the past. But you can learn a lot from those businesses that had those processes in place already.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that, and certainly in terms of putting processes and frameworks in place, it's really important to make sure that the processes are relevant to each organisation, because the last thing you want is smaller organisations or organisations that don't have that same level of risk being subject to imposed frameworks that really don't meet them and are just wasting their time and effort with paperwork or unnecessary activities. So yeah, it's very important to get that tailored to the risks. And that comes back to the first couple of things that were in the due diligence framework that we just talked about, A and B, understanding, and I'll just go to the next one, which is understanding that risk picture. So if you look at what those first two categories were, they're about trying to get organisations, and particularly the offices, to really understand what the risk picture is for their organisation.
I think the other interesting thing is that this concept of due diligence is not a new one. It's something that existed under the previous legislation, although not in this form. It wasn't set out in the legislation. It was a defence that you ran, for example, in New South Wales. But these concepts are not new. The problem is they're peppered throughout the case law, you know, and the law generally, that these are your obligations when exercising due diligence. So I think, as Sharon said earlier, they're in one respect they're a blessing because they're set out there and they said, look, these are your obligations. Here's a guideline. Off you go. They're also not just a blessing, but a bit of a curse, because on the other hand, it's pretty apparent if you haven't met them, if you have, you know, tick one of those boxes. And also, there's a real challenge because, as we've just discussed, there are many businesses out there that just hadn't turned their mind to it.
And I think that is the real key thing, that there is a lot of companies that really haven't looked at this stuff yet. But when you boil it down, the due diligence is really good business practice. So it's the key fundamentals of operating your business with your finger on the pulse. And I think these obligations that are listed in the due diligence section here in section 27 are really important for all businesses, irrespective of the size of the business or the industry. They're issues that you really need to be on top of as an officer of a business.
I'm curious, how hard is it to stay on top of this, particularly for a small business? You know, and now that more of the small businesses are being captured within the framework, at what point do you need professional help? You know, as opposed to trying to muddle through it on your own. Either of you.
Yeah, well, I think it's very difficult to do without professional help. And the bigger the organisation, obviously, the more likely you are to have in-house professional help. So the bigger the organisation, the more likely you are to have an OHS manager who's going to be trained and have a degree or some qualifications in work health and safety. The more likely that they are to have organised for the board to have had training themselves, or have trained the board themselves and the other officers in the organisation, and to have briefed them and put in place processes to deal with it. So I think the biggest challenge is for small business, and I think we keep coming back to this. The biggest challenge is for small businesses and those businesses that traditionally haven't had to turn their mind, or they haven't felt that they've had to turn their mind to this, unless they've been on the end of a prosecution, at which case it's too late.
Yes, and I think it is very important that organisations, particularly small organisations, do get that professional advice and guidance, because it's not always easy to identify the risks that are inherent in your organisation, particularly if you're not trained in that, if you haven't had that exposure before, and to get somebody who is trained, professional in the area, expert in the area. A small organisation wouldn't, in an industry, you know, that say typically an office-based industry, wouldn't need that ongoing expertise 24/7, but certainly to have somebody come in that can help them with a risk assessment, that can help them understand what the risks are that emanate from the business that they have and the nature of their business operations, I think is really important. And I think one of the things, and we'll have a look at, there's a couple of issues that I'll come to in a minute, which are some of the hidden risks within those types of organisations that people don't necessarily think about. But one of the key things about this idea of a risk picture is helping the directors and those that are making those major decisions in the company to understand work as it's actually practiced. And that's something that we've seen within the health and safety literature at the moment, is this gap between work as imagined and what the senior management might think happens on a day-to-day level, and work as people actually practice it. And that may be because that's the way it needs to be done to be practical. So we need to try and reduce that gap, and that's what this tries to do.
I think, Sharon, I'm going right back now to one of your early slides, and your introduction, you referred to the traditional view of work health and safety, and you had some photos up of heavy industry. And I think there's still a huge portion of the demographic of businesses out there that still have that view. I think that when we are seeing advances in work health and safety, such as the new bullying laws, and I say that even though it's in the Fair Work Act and within the Fair Work jurisdiction, that is really a health and safety jurisdiction. It's a crossing over the jurisdictions, a cross-pollination between industrial and work health and safety. People sometimes say things always come full circle, and you know, many years ago we always had the industrial officers dealing with work health and safety and HR matters, and they sort of separated, and now we've got that coming together again. But that really raises an issue for businesses who are not in heavy industry, who will now see an increase in terms of their risk, their exposure to action brought by employees and complaints brought by employees, both to the Fair Work Commission and to the various work cover and work safe regulators around the country in relation to bullying matters. And these laws, this particular aspect of the law, the due diligence obligations, is something that a work health and safety inspector, whatever jurisdiction you're in, or a Fair Work member will want to see has been put in place. And if someone turns up with a bullying complaint, whether it be the Fair Work Commission or Work Cover or WorkSafe, and or both, and they want to investigate, the first thing they want to see is your policies, your procedures, and what you're doing in terms of your health and safety systems. And this is a key part of your system. So for even the smallest employers, you're exposed if you haven't got something there at your fingertips that demonstrates we've complied. We have, this is what we do to meet our obligations. This is what our officers do to meet their obligations. Here you go. And that's your first line. It's a very basic question that an inspector asks before they even get into the facts and circumstances of a particular complaint. They're going to want to have a look at those health and safety systems. So just coming back to the issue of professional help, Ray, that you've just asked, at the very least you want to be doing, you want to be engaging with your health and safety subscriptions, whether it's the one of the health and safety subscriptions that Consulting and Solutions offers. You want to be doing things like even participating in this webinar that we're doing now. This is something that you can put down as part of your compliance, because there are things that we'll be saying today that will help you gain a greater understanding of what your obligations are, and that demonstrates under point A, that you've taken a step to acquire and keep up-to-date knowledge of WHS matters. So that goes into your list. It doesn't satisfy the obligation totally, but it gets you part of the way there.
Yeah, it certainly helps. And all of that, getting together that risk picture then facilitates making better decisions. If you're understanding your business and talking about some of these less hazardous environments, even things as simple as deciding on staff allocation. I mean, one of the things that we've seen recently is this tendency to remove some of the middle management supervisory levels. And when you've got health and safety obligations around supervision, around, adequate staffing levels, then these are decisions that, you may not be thinking of the health and safety impact without something like this legislation, which makes it really clear and nice and easy to see that these are the obligations that you have. These are the sorts of things that you really need to be thinking about in terms of making those decisions. And so in terms of the decisions senior managers are making, if they don't understand the risk picture, you've got issues like setting up inappropriate strategy and goals, heading off in the wrong direction, purchasing the wrong machinery, or these sorts of things where you then incur a whole lot of extra costs, or you're increasing your risk because you're just not understanding what those risks are. Inadequate and inappropriate resource allocation, not putting the resources in the right place because you don't really understand where the risks are. And we all know stories about ineffective performance management systems or incentives where they're set up with all the best of intentions, but they might actually be motivating some rather dysfunctional kind of consequences if we don't understand what the potential is there. And what that results in is negative impact to the business. You've lost productivity, it's less efficient, and you may be contributing to corporate level risk factors. And for those of you that are familiar with the work of Andrew Hopkins, for example, he's done quite a number of analyses, and I know this is really intricate and complicated, but basically this is taken from his analysis of the Esso gas plant explosion down at Longford in Victoria. And what he's done there is he's had a look and said, look, here's the explosion. What caused the explosion? Was it the person pressing the button? Or can we trace it back through and say, why did he press the button? Why did that happen? And then why did that happen? And as you go back, you see things coming back to things like cost cutting, which is a corporate level decision. And that's driving a lot of these other contributing factors that are implicated in the incident itself. We had things that he's identified like the performance measurement system, focusing on lost time injuries. And there was so much focus on that one measure that it took attention away from other things that should have been focused on and promoted the wrong kinds of behaviours. And then back to, we talked about verification before and auditing. So poor auditing systems, things weren't being verified, and that's then contributed to this as well. So the due diligence framework really gives us a way of targeting these corporate level factors that can be serious contributing factors in terms of risk of injury and illness.
It's a good book, and a real example of how you can sometimes learn a lot from what went wrong rather than what went right.
Yes, yes. I think some of the key things, and there's a number of books like that. I know Andrew Hopkins has written a number of them about different incidents that have happened, and you see other analyses of incidents that have happened, and they're more and more pointing out some of the hidden hazards that we have within organisations. Things that are not as obvious as the boiling hot liquid or, the machine and guarding issues, you've got things like capital expenditure and infrastructure decisions. So when we purchase machinery, are we looking at buy safe, buy quiet? Are we conscious of the fact that it may need to be modified to make it safe once we actually purchase it? One of the organisations that we were dealing with in our research just recently was talking about their capital expenditure purchasing process and the risk assessments that are embedded in those processes. So it's a really conscious decision to look out for the risks that might be there with any capital expenditure purchase. Organisational change, now it might be mergers, acquisitions. We've seen an example recently with Cootes Transport and Macaleese. You buy a new company, you've got to be very conscious of what the safety picture is like, as well as the financial picture, and the issues, you know, with the safety of the trucks then presented problems for Macaleese Transport, which needed to be addressed, and as we all know, caused a number of issues. So these are things that are part of that due diligence framework that we need to be conscious of when we've got organisational change happening as well. Different safety cultures. One of the organisations we were dealing with was telling us they regularly take over other companies, and one of the greatest barriers they face is every time they take over a new company, they've got to look at the safety culture of that company and then try and drag it to the very strong safety culture that they have in their own organisation, and the amount of resources and energy that has to go into that process is something that they see as very important to get them all on board so they're all singing from the same songbook. But it's something that's important to take into account.
It is, and I think there's a real positive for businesses there that might one day sell their business because I think that there is a potential to detract from the value of the business if you do have a poor safety culture.
Yeah. Yeah, and resourcing decisions, if we can just jump onto resourcing, one of the things within the legislation, point C says it needs to have available and use appropriate resources and processes. That's looking at financial resources, as we know, and I think there's two different aspects to financial resourcing of health and safety. On the one hand, you've got the traditional sense where you are resourcing health and safety. So you've got your routine things, your health and safety department, you've got your PPE that you're purchasing, you've got your regular repairs and maintenance. You've got non-routine things, so when an issue comes up and you realise you've got a risk that you haven't noticed before or something new's come about, you need to address that as and when they occur. But I think the other side is resourcing safe work rather than resourcing health and safety or work health and safety. And if you flip it around and you say, let's look at resourcing safe work, that's really about focusing on making sure all of the processes that are happening in your organisation are done safely. So not setting up systems, performance management systems, for example, that prioritise unsafe work. And of course, no one would do that deliberately, but we do find that it happens inadvertently, and that's really important to keep in mind. And the other side of resourcing, I mean, there's different aspects, but the two key ones there, human resources is another one. So looking at safe staffing levels and workloads, appropriate workloads. We've seen some work come out from Safe Work Australia recently on stress claims and the incidence, the rising incidence of stress claims. And so that level of resourcing when it comes to staffing levels and workloads, as well as the sort of interpersonal issues, as you were just talking about a moment ago, Joe, with bullying, it's really important to make sure that the resourcing of human resources is taken into account and, you know, really done with safety in mind. Also processes, ensuring the PCBU has the processes in place to eliminate and minimise risk. The hierarchy of control, as it's set out in the new legislation, I think is another, by having the due diligence and the hierarchy of control there, it opens the way for some really useful conversations with management. And I'll show you a slide I've actually just done as part of the work that we've been doing. We did some presentations with CPAs, accounting managers and CFOs, and trying to explain to them how the hierarchy of controls work. So I've got a little example here I thought I'd show you, and this is one we were working with senior management, and of course most of you will be from a health and safety background, so you'll have a much greater knowledge of this. But talking to them about saying a broken chair, so making it meaningful for all organisations. So say you've got a broken chair and this is a hazard. There's a number of ways you can address it. You can eliminate it, throw it out, get rid of the broken chair, get a new one, or not get a new one. You might have a standing office and eliminate it that way by not needing chairs. Alternatively, you can engineer the broken chair to come up with a new solution. Now, it's more stable. I don't know that that's going to be completely risk-free. I think you're still going to have some level of risk, and so that really highlights the fact that while the risk is less by at least having it all at the same level, when you engineer solutions, you're not necessarily eliminating the risk, you're minimising it to some extent. You could isolate the person from the hazard, so put the chair outside, better still, put hazard tape all over it so people know not to sit on it. Really isolate it from the people that are using that chair. The one that was interesting, got an interesting response, was about training. And this is where some of the managers we deal with tend to go as a first point of call. Let's just train people how to use it properly. We'll leave it hazardous and we'll tell them, look, the chair's broken, we're not going to fix it. So when you sit down, I want you to stand very straight in front of the chair, sit very slowly, and then when you're seated, make no sudden movements. So you're sort of training people around how to use the chair safely. And yes, it's an option, but clearly it's nowhere near as good at reducing or eliminating that risk. And the final one, of course, as we all know, is PPE. So we can wrap them in cotton wool and say, sit on the chair, it's not actually working properly, it's broken, so I want you to wear your PPE in case you fall off the chair, then you won't get as hurt. So this was a way that we used to try and explain the hierarchy of controls and really draw attention to the fact that if we start at the top as we're supposed to and look at, is there really any way of eliminating that risk, we're going to have a much better outcome. Okay, if I can just duck to the next one. The other thing that I think has been really useful in terms of the changes in the legislation is that we're looking at processes for receiving, considering and responding in a timely way to information. We're no longer just saying, get information about injuries. It's really about the whole process. You have to have processes for considering and responding to the information, which I think is an important thing to have articulated in the legislation. It addresses issues of responsibility and accountability, and the other key thing there is that you're not just looking at injuries. It's not just incidents. They're looking at hazards and risks as well, and for very good reason, because that means you're actually looking at safety. What we tend to see, and we've certainly found this in a lot of the research we've done, whether it's looking at annual reports or going into companies, a lot of companies focus on lost time injuries and fatalities. And one of the studies that we did with Jeff McDonald, who some of you may know, we looked at a very large bank of injury data from WorkCover New South Wales and classified those as lost time injuries and fatalities, just to look at those more serious ones. So the blue ones you can see there are lost time injury rates. They're reducing in number. The fatalities, believe it or not, is reducing in number over time, and so that's improving. Now this is the information that most officers would have traditionally received. But we then took that exact same data and recast it as ones that permanently impact a person's life or temporarily impact a person's life. And what we found was there was a huge reduction in the temporary disability or temporary impairment, but an increasing rate of permanent disability. Now, if you're only looking at lost time injury and fatality data, you don't get to see that. So this is why it's really important that we start thinking a bit more carefully about the information that we're giving to our officers that they're using to make decisions. The reason that we have that discrepancy in the diagram there is because lost time injuries don't measure injury and they don't measure safety. They certainly don't measure safety, but they're a very poor measure of injury as well. And you can see from the little diagram there with the circles, lost time injuries only capture a proportion of injuries. They miss nearly all of the illnesses, they fail to capture all injuries, and they don't even capture necessarily the most serious ones. You could have permanent disabilities in terms of hearing loss, for example, and that may not be captured as a lost time injury.
I think, Sharon, what you're saying is two things. One is LTIs, it is entirely unsatisfactory if this is all you're getting. And I guarantee you there are still businesses out there where the officers, this is all they're getting still.
Yes.
Perhaps a little bit more. But nonetheless, excuse me, nonetheless, it's still, I think it's still important to get this information, but you need all the data behind it. You need it broken down. It's not satisfactory simply to get those numbers on how your LTIs are running and fatalities. And many businesses, they won't even have fatalities, but for the smaller businesses, but they will still have that LTI.
That's right. That's right. And I think, you know, the lost time injury rates are not telling you much about injury frequency. They tell you even less about severity. Like if we look at what a lost time injury includes, it includes a whole lot of different ranges: fatality, permanent absence, long-term absence, moderate, temporary. So it doesn't tell you anything about severity, as we just saw with that previous diagram. And really, at the end of the day, lost time injuries are a measure of lost productivity. So in a way, we almost need to take them out of the safety debate. Yes, they're a useful measure still. Managers would like to know it because it tells them about the operation of the business and what impact health and safety has had on production, but it doesn't tell about safety. What we need to be looking at safety, flip the triangle upside down. We need to be focusing on those class 1 events, which tell us more. Conscious of time, if I can just duck through a couple more slides here. The other aspect, which I think the legislation is really drawing out as a little more important, is saying not only look at the injuries, but look at the hazards and the risks. So we need to have some way of communicating information about hazards and risks. And that's really looking, whether you're looking at near misses, whether you're looking at risk ratings of the different hazards that you've identified. But one of the important things, which serves both an information and a verification aspect, is looking at the effectiveness of our defences. So if we think about the controls we've put in place to address hazards and look at how are we evaluating the effectiveness of those controls. A lot of companies run around and check and say, have we got the control in place? Yes, tick, and that's good, but that's only half the story. Is the control effective? Is it doing what you want it to do? And is it successful in that sense? And that's where we really need to be looking. So indicators of the effort that's going in terms of what are the activities we're doing, what are the processes that are happening, and then how effective are they? You'll see I've got leading and lagging there, which may have a few people scratching their heads. We tend to think of leading indicators as everything that's before an injury and lagging as an injury. Injuries are an example of a lagging indicator, but they are not a lagging indicator. Like all lagging indicators are not necessarily injuries. So for example, training. You put some training in place, the amount of courses you run, the number of people you send on them would be leading indicators of training. How many people are effectively trained and competent at the end would be a lagging indicator of training. So it doesn't have to be injury related. And I think in terms of putting that information forward, when you're communicating the information, here's something we need to think about. Look at our leading indicators, and we've seen a lot more focus on leading indicators coming through. If you're putting a lot of effort into risk management and control, your leading indicators look fantastic, but your injuries are still really high, then you've got a mismatch between what you're doing, the efforts that you're making, and what you need to be doing in terms of preventing injury and illness. So that's probably a useful little thing to think about there. If you're putting no effort in and you've got really good safety outcomes, then you need to be aware that that could just be luck. And perhaps that may change. So you need to actually be focusing a little bit, just make sure that you know what those risks and hazards are.
Fair enough.
And then back to the verification, so assuring the resources and processes. Audits and inspections, indicators of the critical defences, as we talked about. So there's a whole lot of work coming out now. Certainly at Macquarie University, we're doing some research around guidelines to help organisations identify what some of their leading indicators might be. Indicators at different levels, so you'll have some indicators at an operational level which are very specific to your organisation. Then you might have some at a management level which sort of summarise those. By the time you get to the officers and directors level, those level indicators tend to be more comparable across organisations. So, and we'll have some more information out about that soon. And I think we'll leave a few minutes there.
Great. Well, thanks very much for that, Sharon and Joe. Now, we're just about out of time. I think what I might do is I'll ask Joe one question that is one that came up, I guess, as a recurring theme with from the people when they were when you guys were registering for the webinar. But it does revolve around the part harmonization and I guess looking at what might happen now. So if WA and Victoria don't end up coming along with the model house legislation, what's the likely outcome of that? What will the situation be like if we can't achieve that full harmonization?
Look, I think that's an unsatisfactory outcome. The idea behind harmonisation was to create business efficiencies, but to ensure that there was, a consistent understanding about what people's obligations are across the country, across the jurisdictions. Having said that, the overriding principles behind all of these, the legislation in each of the states and territories as they currently stand, as they stood before, was really very similar in many respects. It was just, most of it was about how they went about doing it. Yeah, sure, New South Wales thought they had it tough because of the reverse onus that was in place, and I won't say they didn't, but that's been fixed. I think that really businesses will have they will have a gap between what is compliance in one state and what is compliance in another. And so what they really need to be doing is just making sure that they've done, it's very much like a gap analysis to work out what they need to be doing in one state in order to comply if they're not doing it in another. And usually, really, there's a simple answer to a lot of those quandaries that arise as a result of a gap that appears between the two states or the territory and the states, depending on where you operate. And that is take the high ground. You may implement a process that's a requirement in one state or territory, but is not a requirement in another state or territory. And if you can take the high ground and just comply with the more stringent requirement in the other state or territory, then you're going to and you can just make sure that you're complying in that other state. So that is all you will do. But there are other inconsistencies, like as I said earlier, New South Wales, the union prosecutions. I mean, I don't think that's a huge one. It sounds like a big one. It hasn't been a big issue yet. That is something that you'd simply whack on your list of inconsistencies. And that is, I don't think it's a huge issue in the overall, concept of health and safety. But from the day-to-day management of their businesses, it's disappointing for businesses who cannot simply understand that they will implement one arrangement and they know that that's compliant across the jurisdictions.
Yeah, well, actually, that makes perfect sense. That if you aim at the most stringent angle, then you're going to cover all the other, possible outcomes.
An example of that might be, right of entry. And we were just talking a little bit earlier before the webinar started about Queensland introducing some tweaking their right of entry requirements so that unions in certain circumstances have to provide, or sorry, I shouldn't say unions, I should say an authorised officer who, or a person who is has the relevant right of entry permit, a permit holder, to enter a premises gives the requisite notice before they enter the workplace. And where a business is truly national in all the states and territories, they really want to be able to implement a policy that they can train their managers on and that everyone understands this is how it works. But if you've got people who are in Queensland, you have to train them differently because the laws are different, then that can be problematic. As I've just said, there's been some amendments up there to bring it in line with some of the other states and territories. But that's just an example of how it can be problematic and painful for business.
I think with the due diligence too, it's one aspect that looking at the new legislation can actually help you implement the legislation, say in Victoria, where it's not specified so clearly. You can look to the legislation elsewhere, in New South Wales, for example, and get some guidance on how to go about implementing what is required in Victoria.
Great.
All right, well, that brings us to the end of our discussion. Sharon and Joe, thanks very much for your time. We hope you found today's session useful. Please feel free to drop us a line at editor@workplaceinfo.com.au if you have any follow-up questions, and make sure you log on to Workplace Info and Workplace WHS for the latest information on compliance and best practices for HR, IR, and work safety professionals. If you want to revisit some of today's presentation, an archive will be published on our YouTube channel which you can watch and listen to at your leisure. The URL will be included in our follow-up correspondence. We'll also be sending you a WHS record-keeping checklist and giving you access to an exclusive video with one of our workplace health and safety consultants. I'd also like to highlight a couple of the upcoming webinars we've got in our ongoing series of discussions aimed at helping Australian businesses stay on top of the latest developments and improve the way you do business. On the 6th of May at noon Eastern Standard Time, our topic will be workplace wellness, while on the 4th of June, we'll be reviewing the top issues in HR, IR, and WHS legislation over the past financial year. Well, thanks very much for your time and best of luck with your work.